that feels really good. This bath is an old friend. I've spent many hours in this bath. In fact, this bath for about 45 years was in our bathroom. And it's a beautiful pink. I think it was second-hand when it went in the first place. But we renovated our bathroom about a year ago, and this got thrown out. We now have a new bath, and we have a new shower in the one room, which we've never had before. We knocked a wall down. The thing about showers are really efficient. They're quick. Baths take longer. They're almost a luxury, indulgence. You use more water. A shower, as long as you don't stay in it too long, is instant. Like you turn the tap on, you got water, and you can jump in a shower and get clean really quickly. When I have a bath, I don't do it to get clean. In fact, if I've got dirty feet, I'll even wash them in the shower first before I hop in the bath, because you don't want to see all the brown stuff moving around at the other end. But are you making comments again, Philip? And so when I get in a bath, it's for the experience. It's to just when you stick your feet up and it's just relaxing, and like especially at the end of a day, if you've been doing stuff and it's a line where you draw and no more work. After the bath, I get out. And what I like to do, if it's winter, I like to get out and put on my Hugh Hefner. This is what my kids call it. I like to put on my dressing gown. And I can just... Vanessa. And then I can just relax. The day's finished and that bath has been just so enjoyable. 2 weeks ago, do you want me to take this off? You need it off, don't you? Yeah.
Come on. There's someone else.
Yeah, sorry, just Father Christmas, whatever. Right. 2 weeks ago, I introduced this thought of soaking in a bathtub of God's grace. And I want to pick that up again today, and there's a reason for it. Because in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, Peter tells us that everything we need for life and godliness is found in God's grace. That's where we find it. So what do you need for life? Sometimes we're not even quite sure. And I was talking to Mark in South Australia this week, and Mark, last time we did baptisms, he drove from South Australia to get baptised here. And he was very happy for me to share part of our conversation. And in our conversation, he asked me, why am I starting to get so emotional when I watch Redgum live streaming? He says, I was never emotional. And as we talked about it, we realised that for years he had just numbed down through alcohol or whatever he could to just numb down. And now, as God's Spirit's come into him, he's now feeling emotion. He's coming alive. He didn't even know he needed that. But now he can see that something has happened, and it's so much better to be alive than to be a numb. So what do you need? Because sometimes we don't know, sometimes we do. And there was a day in my life when I didn't know what I needed. And so old mate Pink Bath and I hopped in there. And what happened that day in this bath is not an exaggeration when I say that it changed my life forever. In this bath, something happened that changed my family's life. It changed so much that as a result of what happened in this bath, my 4 grandkids were all born in Sydney, started life as city kids. That's a terrible thing to happen to any kid. I watched my youngest granddaughter the other day run around the paddock with those little feral goats that I had here one day, and we've hand raised them, and she just spent hours playing with the goats. Couldn't do that in Sydney. And so that day in this bath, something so significant happened that this morning when Martin was leading worship here, Martin would not be here if it wasn't for what happened in this bath, because I'd never have met him. We would never have ended up shifting to Sydney. Our daughter Mandy and her husband Aaron would have not spent 20 years in large churches in full-time ministry. When I saw my little Remy running around the paddock with the goats on Friday, reminded me of a mum when she was 5, Bronnie. And she would just go out in the paddocks and all she wanted to do was be a Hillsong worship leader. Where does that come from, a little 5-year-old kid? Because of what happened in this bath, she got to live that dream when they were in Sydney. And it was in the year 2000 when this happened with this bath. Sydney Olympics. And at the time, I was a youth pastor, what's now Riviera. And I had one goal in life. I wanted to be the oldest youth leader in country Victoria. Angela, do you remember when I had more hair than this? And yeah, you were part of that back then, you know. And that was my goal. I wanted to take me out in a wheelchair. I'm going to be 89 and still running youth programs, right? And I was sick this day, and I was home, and I was in bed. And as I'm lying in bed, I felt God's Spirit talking to me and almost like changing the course of my life. And I felt God calling me to no longer be a youth pastor, but to lead a church. And it never entered my head. And I was so overwhelmed with this, I didn't know what to do. So I started running the bath. And I can remember as I was running the bath, this one big question kept hitting me. Was I willing to pay the price to lead a church? And I didn't know what that price would be. 14 years later, Coral and I are leading a church in Sydney. And we're packing the car to come back here to see my mum, who was in Sale Hospital in intensive care. And as we're packing the car, I got a phone call to say that Mum had passed away. That's the only day ever in my life I felt like the price was too high. But back that day in 2000, when I'm in this little bath here, and I didn't know what to do, I'd felt God almost like waves of vision for what could be possible in a church, what it could feel like, what it could look like, how that would impact people's lives. And these waves and waves of vision of what was possible was hitting me. So I grabbed my Bible, which is this one here, right? I grabbed this Bible. I went and hopped in this bath. And I opened up at Acts chapter 10. And in there it's describing when Peter is overwhelmed by this vision and he doesn't know what to do with it. And God is directing him and leading him. And almost like word for word, I felt God speak to me so clearly, probably the clearest in my whole life. And I knew God was calling us to lead a church. Some of you don't actually have a bath in your house. You have showers. And I think probably this morning, nearly everyone that got ready, you had a shower, not a bath. Did anyone have a bath this morning? No, not one. Some of you probably don't think you need a bath. I used to think I only needed one or a shower once every 6 months, whether you need it or not, but Coral tells me no, you need to wash, and I can do that now. But see, showers are so efficient. They're quick, they're convenient, and you can sort of hop under and hop out and get dry and away you go. But God's kingdom works to a different pace, a different rhythm. In Romans chapter 5, Paul mentions my little pink bath. He does. Okay, Joel, he may not exactly use those words, right? But that's what Paul is talking about. He's talking about my little pink bath and our shower. Because both have a really important role in our life. We need showers and we need baths. And in verse 17 of Romans chapter 5, Paul says this: "For if because of one man's trespass, which is Adam, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace," that's the bathtub, "and the free gift of righteousness," that's the shower, that's where we get clean. And he says, when we experience that, he says, you will reign in life through this one man, Jesus. You'll reign. You'll reign. That word reign means to exercise dominion. It's to bring order out of chaos. So what do you need? When your circumstances feel like they're against you, when you can't see a way through, what do you need? Soaking in a bathtub of abundant grace. And when we mess up, and when your past eats away at you, we need that shower where we're washed clean and we experience God's forgiveness, and he declares us right in his eyes. Very powerful. Now just come with me for a moment back to when I was 18. And I was pig hunting in Western New South Wales. And my mate suggested to us, we're about half an hour out of this little town, and he suggested us that we drive into this town to a thing called a payphone. Now, I know it's technology that some of you are very ignorant about, but they had phones connected to things back in those days. And we drove in there to talk to our girlfriends. And afterwards, we were so excited. Having spoken to our girlfriends, we started driving back to this station we were pig hunting on, and instead of seeing the entrance to the station, we just kept driving. 20 kilometres past before we realised, because we're in this little bubble of euphoria having spoken to our girls. When I was coming back from opal mining with my grandson Jesse a few weeks ago, I decided to call in at this same station. Hadn't been there for nearly 50 years. And it was raining, so we camped in the shearing shed this night. And about 8 o'clock at night, I got this thing out of my pocket called a mobile phone. And I rang Coral. And as I was speaking to her in the dark, I remembered 50 years earlier ringing the same girl who I married. And I remembered my mate, he married his girlfriend that he rang that night. But their marriage didn't last. And tragically and sadly, he has no contact with his own kids and his grandkids. And here I was, living an adventure with my 14-year-old grandson and in love with the same girl from those 50 years earlier. And it hit me. That's God's grace. It's not my goodness. It's God's grace. When Coral's mum was alive, I'm sure she prayed many, many times for me. Help him, Jesus, help him. And so you know, if you know me, it's only God's grace that has got us through the hard times. But here's our problem. Every time I've used the word grace, and we love to sing about grace, as Christians, we talk about God's grace. We love to thank God for his grace. But when you hear that word, what does grace mean? I want to hear what you think. What grace? It's not a trick question. What's a definition of grace? Your pardon? Undeserved privilege, yep. Any other, yep. Yeah. Unmerited favour, yep. You're right. If you do a Google search, it'll basically come up with those sorts of words. It'll come up with undeserved favour. And I understand why that's what you are telling me, because that's what we have been taught. We put the word undeserved before the word grace. And when Paul, when he wrote those words in Romans chapter 5, and he's describing this bathtub of grace, the experience of grace, he doesn't put that word in front of the word grace. He puts a Greek word called parisia, and it means a form of abundance that exceeds our normal expectations, that it's super abundant, and it comes from a root word, and I love this picture. It's a picture of a flower bud coming into full bloom. That's the sort of grace that he's describing. But there's one modern translation that changes the meaning completely of what Paul says. And this is what this modern translation says. It says, God has treated us with undeserved grace. And that is butchering God's truth in his word. And that's because of a Western bias we have in our Western churches about grace. And we shift Paul's emphasis off God's abundant, overflowing, more than enough amazing grace, and we shift the focus onto our undeservedness. I had a friend who messed up in his marriage. And he shared with his wife what he had done, and she was willing to forgive him and to rebuild their marriage. And he went to God and asked God to forgive him as well. But then he said to me, Lex, I can't forgive myself. I don't deserve forgiveness. and their marriage was never put back together, and their kids grew up without a mum and a dad, and both parents have lived broken, all because the focus was on undeservedness. There are 156 verses in the New Testament speaking about grace. And I have read every single one of them in preparing for today. Not one of them, not one teaches that grace is undeserved. Not one. Grace is medicine for the soul. It's not a hammer of shame. It's not a little highlighter where we run through our undeservedness. Now, I understand why that definition has come about in our church culture. It's been birthed out of a false humility and a wrong identity. I've shared this before, but when we were still living in Sydney, Coral and I were driving back there one time, and we get stuck behind all this traffic going up this slow hill, and at the front of this line of traffic is a combi. And this combi's having trouble getting up these tall hills, high hills. On the back of this combi is a big sign, and it says, "Jesus loves you, but I'm his favourite." Now, that may be wrong theology, but it is a great identity. Paul found his identity in God's grace, plus he had great theology with it. And this is what he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10. He says this, "I am what I am by God's grace, and God's grace hasn't been for nothing." In other words, God hasn't wasted his grace on me. Look what I've done with it. He says, in fact, I've worked harder than all the others. And you think, hang on. That sounds like pride. No, that's humility. It's being honest with what God is doing in your life. And then he says, that is, it wasn't me, but the grace of God that is with me. You deserve God's grace because he's chosen you and you have responded. And that's what positions us to receive. See, God doesn't just love combi drivers. He is love. He doesn't just show us grace. He is grace. Grace is a person. And Paul, in his letter to Titus, puts it this way in chapter 2 and verse 11 of Titus. He says, "For the grace of God that brings healing and wholeness," that's what the word salvation means, "has appeared to all men." He's describing Jesus. So on Sunday, our live stream failed, the last third. And I apologise for that. We try our best not to. Technology is technology, and sometimes things go wrong. But what we can do is we're re-recording now for your sake, because you're important. People have been asking, can they get the last bit of the message? And so that's what I want to do right now for you. When we say that grace is undeserved, the problem in doing that is we diminish our role in grace, in experiencing grace. The first time we are exposed to the concept of grace in the whole of the Bible is in Genesis chapter 6, and it's talking about Noah. And in verse 8 of that chapter, it says, "But Noah found favour or found grace in the eyes of God." And the word found in that situation is an ancient Hebrew word, and it means attained. And then the next verse, it says how he attained God's grace. And it says, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God." So please don't tell me that the grace that Noah experienced was undeserved, because he positioned himself to receive God's grace. In the opening pages of the New Testament, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 30, we find very similar language. when the angel appears to Mary, and the angel says to Mary, "Don't be afraid, for you have found grace. You've found favour with God." And that word "found" in the context of that verse means obtained. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say. We absolutely cannot earn God's favour. Or in the words of Paul in Romans chapter 11, verse 6, grace would not be grace. A couple of weeks ago, someone sent me a text message after church. Now, I share this with their permission. I'm not sort of showing you or telling you who it is, but they are very happy for me to share this. I'm going to read the text message to you they sent me. "My deepest wound is the lie that I am not chosen. This morning, the wound of not being chosen was particularly loud. And so on the way to church, I was praying against that and reminding myself that God has chosen me. I asked him to help me receive the truth of those words, 'I have chosen you.'" So when you shared the verses from Ephesians this morning, talking about what I did on that morning, it brought me to tears to receive such a clear, timely confirmation and much needed answer to my prayer. Now, the backstory of that text message is that when I was walking out of our house that morning, I had this thought, maybe I should grab my Bible. I don't normally bring my Bible to church, but I went back in the house and I grabbed it because I had this sense that God wanted me to share a verse out of that for someone. I had no idea what verse. And during the worship, just before I got up to preach, I opened my Bible, and the very page, the first page I opened to, were these words that were already highlighted in Ephesians chapter 1. I want you to see that. "For he has chosen us." That is the very words that this person was praying and asking God to confirm for them. What are the odds of that happening? Of all the verses in the Bible that I could pick, no, this is the hand of God. It's God's grace at work. And the thing is that this person positioned themselves that morning to receive God's grace. They couldn't make it happen, but they played a role. They prayed and asked, and they tried to come against this lie that was just crushing them. That's how grace works. 5 times in the book of John, John describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I think John might have been a previous combi owner of that combi van that was going up that hill. I think he might have been one of the previous owners. The way he sees himself comes through soaking in a bathtub of God's grace, where his identity and his relationship with Jesus is so secure that he can describe himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And John wants you and I to experience that in our life now. And in the first chapter of the book that he writes, he says this about Jesus. He says, "For Jesus came full of grace and truth." And then in verse 16 of chapter 1, he says this, "From his fullness, which is Jesus, we have all received grace upon grace." All is a very inclusive word. There's no wriggle room. That includes all of us. All of us have received. But that's past tense of what Jesus did on the cross. It's like, by his stripes we have been healed. It's past tense. It's done. Experiencing that is a different story. See, what Jesus did on the cross, he ran the bath. The bathtub's full. The water's the perfect temperature for you, for me. But we can position ourselves. We have a role to be part of that experience. And when we define grace as undeserved favour, that cultural bias robs us of participating, of seeing that we play a role. Can't earn it, but we can position ourselves. here's the good part. Grace is a person called Jesus. And to experience this grace, it's as simple as saying yes to the next thing that God's Spirit whispers to you. And you step out in obedience. And you follow those little crumbs. And you'll experience all of Jesus in your life. And you'll get to soak in the grace that is for us, that's been poured out, ready, waiting for you and for I. And I'm encouraged because if you're watching this now, if you've watched to the end of this live stream, if you've hung in there, if you've picked this back up because you'd seen part of it and now you're watching the last part of it, you have a hunger for the things of God. You want this grace. You want to experience Jesus. That's a powerful thing, and I'm encouraged for you. Because when Jesus said, if we will seek, if we will ask, and if we'll keep on asking and keep on knocking and he will fill us. It's his promise. So thank you for staying with us. Thank you. We appreciate all of you online. I understand some of your stories. I would like to hear more of them. I want to thank you and I want to pray for you. God, I thank you for every person that is connected to your truth through the live streaming of Redgum. I thank you that you breathe life and vitality into our very being when we connect with you, when we have this relationship with you, when we soak in your presence, when we experience you. You are grace. You are the person that we encounter, and through encountering you, we experience your grace, and we can pass that on to those in our world around us. Thank you for being part of Redgum. We'll catch you next week. See ya.